So the live stream crashed. So let's try that again. Oopsie. One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6-second delay. Alright, back to Cthulhu.
Stopped beyond the hills to the northwest. The men from Arkham were undecided what to do. Seeking shelter from the increasing rainfall beneath one of the few undestroyed Fry outbuildings, they debated the wisdom of waiting or of taking the aggressive and going down into the glen in quest of their nameless, monstrous quarry. The downpour waxed in heaviness, and distant peals of thunder sounded from far horizons. Sheet lightning shimmered, and then a forky bolt flashed near at hand, as if descending into the accursed glen itself. The sky grew very dark, and the watchers hoped that the storm would prove a short, sharp one, followed by clear weather. It was still gruesomely dark when, not much over an hour later, a confused babble of voices sounded down the road. Another moment brought to view a frightened group of more than a dozen men running, shouting, and even whimpering hysterically. Someone in the lead began sobbing out words, and the Arkham men started violently when those words developed a coherent form. "Oh my God, my God!" The voice choked out. "It's coming again, and this time by day. It's out. It's out and a-moving this very minute, and only the Lord knows when it'll be on us all." The speaker panted into silence, but another took up his message.
9 hours ago, Zip Watley here heard the phone ringing, and it was Miss Corey, George's wife, that lives down by the junction. She says the hired boy Luther was out driving in the cows from the storm out of the big boat, when he sees all the trees a-bending at the mouth of the glen opposite side to this, and smelled the same awful smell like he smelt when he found the big tracks last Monday morning. And he says, there was a swishing, lapping sound, more than all what bending trees and bushes could make, and all on a sudden, the trees along the road begun to get pushed one side, and there was an awful stomping and splashing in the mud. But mind you, Luther, he didn't see nothing at all, only just the bending trees and underbrush. Then, fur ahead where Bishop's Brook goes under the road, he heard an awful creaking and straining on the bridge, and he says he could tell the sound of wood is starting to crack and split, and all the whiles he never see a thing, only them trees and bushes are bending. And when the swishing sound got very far off, on the road towards Wizard Watley's and Sentinel Hill, Luther, he had the guts to step up where he'd heard it first and look at the ground. It was all mud and water, and the sky was dark, and the rain was wiping out all tracks about as fast as could be. But beginning at the glen mouth, where the trees had moved, there was still some of them awful prints, big as bar is, like he seen Monday.
At this point, the first excited speaker interrupted. "But that ain't the trouble now. That was only the start. Zeb here was calling folks up, and everybody was listening in when a call from Seth Bishop's cut in. His housekeeper, Sally, was carrying on fit to kill. She just seed the trees a-bending beside the road and says there was a kind of mushy sound, like an elephant puffing and treading, heading for the house. Then she up and spoke sudden to fearful smell. Says her boy Chancey was a-screaming as how it was just like when he smelt up to the Whiteley ruins Monday morning, and the dogs was all barking and whining awful. And then she let out a terrible yell and says the shed down the road, it just caved in like the storm he'd blowed it over, only the wind wasn't strong enough to do that. Everybody was listening, and we could hear lots of folks on the wire gasping. All to once, Sally, she yelled again and says the front yard picket fence, it just crumbled up, though there wasn't no sign of what done it. Then everybody on line could hear Chancey and old Seth Bishop yelling too, and Sally was shrieking out that something heavy struck the house. Not lightning or nothing, but something heavy again in the front that kept launching itself again and again, though he couldn't see nothing out the front windows. And then, Lines of fright deepened on every face, and Armitage, shaken as he was, had barely poise enough to prompt the speaker. And then, Sally, she yelled out, "Oh hell, the house is caving in." And on the wire, we could hear a terrible crashing, and a whole flock of screaming, just like when Elmer Fry's place was took, only worse. The man paused, and another of the crowd spoke. "That's all. Not a sound nor a squeak over the phone after that. Just still like. We that heard it got out forwards and wagons and rounded up as many able-bodied menfolks as we could get at Corey's place and come up here to see what you thought best to do. Not but what I think it's the Lord's judgment for our iniquities that no mortal kin ever set aside." Armitage saw that the time for positive action had come and spoke decisively to the faltering group of frightened rustics. "We must follow it, boys." He made his voice as reassuring as possible. "I believe there's a chance of putting it out of business. You men know that those Wadleys were wizards. Well, this thing is a thing of wizardry, and must be put down by the same means. I've seen Wilbur Wadley's diary, and read some of the strange old books he used to read, and I think I know the right kind of spell to recite to make the thing fade away. Of course, one can't be sure, but we can always take a chance. It's invisible. I knew it would be. But there's a powder in this long-distance spray that might make it show up for a second. Later on, we'll try it. It's a frightful thing to have alive, but it isn't as bad as what Wilbur would have let in if he'd lived longer. You'll never know what the world has escaped. Now we've only this thing to fight, and it can't multiply. It can, though, do a lot of harm, so we mustn't hesitate to rid the community of it. We must follow it, and the way to begin is to go to the place that has just been wrecked. Let somebody lead the way. I don't know your roads very well, but I've an idea there might be a shorter cut across lots. How about it?" The men shuffled about a moment, and then Earl Sawyer spoke softly, pointing with a grimy finger through the steadily lessening rain. "I guess you can get to Seth Bishop's quickest by cutting across the lower meadow here, wading the brook at the low place, and climbing through Carrier's mowing, and the timber lot beyond. That comes out on the upper rud, mighty nigh Seth's, a little to the other side." Armitage, with Rice and Morgan, started to walk in the direction indicated, and most of the natives followed slowly. The sky was growing lighter, and there were signs that the storm had worn itself away. When Armitage inadvertently took a wrong direction, Joe Osborne warned him and walked ahead to show the right one. Courage and confidence were mounting, though the twilight of the almost perpendicular wooded hill, which lay toward the end of their shortcut, and among whose fantastic ancient trees they had to scramble as if up a ladder, put these qualities to a severe test. At length, they emerged on a muddy road to find the sun coming out. They were a little beyond the Seth Bishop place, but bent trees and hideously unmistakable tracks showed what had passed by. Only a few moments were consumed in surveying the ruins just around the bend. It was the Fry incident all over again, and nothing dead or living was found in either of the collapsed shells, which had been the Bishop house and barn. No one cared to remain there amidst the stench and tarry stickiness, but all turned instinctively to the line of horrible prints leading on toward the wrecked Watley farmhouse and the altar-crowned slopes of Sentinel Hill. As the men passed the site of Wilbur Watley's abode, they shuddered visibly and seemed again to mix hesitancy with their zeal. It was no joke tracking down something as big as a house that one could not see, but had had all the vicious malevolence of a demon. Opposing the base of Sentinel Hill, the tracks left the road, and there was a fresh bending and matting visible along the broad swath, marking the monster's former route to and from the summit. Armitage produced a pocket telescope of considerable power and scanned the steep green side of the hill. Then he handed the instrument to Morgan, whose sight was keener. After a moment of gazing, Morgan cried out sharply, passing the glass to Earl and indicating a certain spot on the slope with his finger. Sawyer, as clumsy as most non-users of optical devices are, fumbled a while, but eventually focused the lenses with Armitage's aid. When he did so, his cry was less restrained than Morgan's had been. God almighty! The grass and bushes is a-moving. It's a-going up. Slow like. Creeping up to the top this minute. Heaven only knows what for. Then the germ of panic seemed to spread among the seekers. It was one thing to chase the nameless entity, but quite another to find it. Spells might be all right, but suppose they weren't. Voices began questioning Armitage about what he knew of the thing, and no reply seemed quite to satisfy.
Don't blame him.
Everyone seemed to feel himself in close proximity to phases of nature and of being, utterly forbidden and wholly outside the sane experience of mankind.
Is that really all the orange leaves I had? Just this little one? I'll put you right up there.
10.
Oops.
In the end, the three men from Arkham, old, white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky, iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr.
Coming
Morgan,
around.
ascended the mountain alone.
Oh! Ah,
After
people!
much
Hello,
patient
people!
instruction regarding its focusing and use, they left the telescope with the frightened group.
Hello, are you still there, Dan? Are you still there? Sorry. I use my eyes. I don't sometimes ask people. I'm sorry. But thank you. I do try to slay. This won't be working very good today, though. Maybe I have more friends.
That remained in the road, and as they climbed, they were watched closely by those among whom the glass was passed around. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled as its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. Then it was obvious that the pursuers were gaining. Curtis Watley, of the undecayed branch, was holding the telescope when the Arkham party detoured radically from the swath. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get to a subordinate peak, which overlooked the swath, at a point considerably ahead of where the shrubbery was now bending. This indeed proved to be true, and the party were seen to gain the minor elevation only a short time after visible blasphemy had passed it. Then, Wesley Corey, who had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer, which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. The crowd stirred uneasily, recalling that this sprayer was expected to give the unseen horror a moment of visibility. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis Watley snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. He saw that Rice, from the party's point of vantage, above and behind the entity, had an excellent chance of spreading the potent powder with marvelous effect. Those without the telescope saw only an instant's flash of gray cloud. A cloud about the size of a moderately large building near the top of the mountain. Curtis, who had held the instrument, dropped it with a piercing shriek into the ankle-deep mud of the road. He reeled and would have crumpled to the ground had not 2 or 3 others seized and steadied him. All he could do was moan half inaudibly.
Oh, great God. That...
There was a pandemonium of questioning, and only Henry Wheeler thought to rescue the fallen telescope and wipe it clean of mud. Curtis was past all coherence, and even isolated replies were almost too much for him.
Bigger than a barn. All made of squirming ropes. Whole thing sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything. With dozens of legs like hogs' heads that half shut up when they step. Nothing solid about it, all like jelly and made of separate wriggling ropes pushed close together. Great bulging eyes all over it. 10 or 20 mouths or trunks sticking out all along the sides, big as stovepipes. And all the tossing and opening and shutting, all gray with kind of blue or purple rings. And God in heaven, that half face on top.
This final memory, whatever it was, proved too much for poor Curtis, and he collapsed completely before he could say more. Fred Farr and Will Hutchins carried him to the roadside and laid him on the damp grass. Henry Wheeler, trembling, turned the rescued telescope on the mountain to see what he might. Through the lenses were discernible 3 tiny figures, apparently running toward the summit as fast as the steep incline allowed. Only these, nothing more. Then, everyone noticed a strangely unseasonable noise in the deep valley behind, and even in the underbrush of Sentinel Hill itself. It was the piping of unnumbered whippoorwills, and in their shrill chorus there seemed to lurk a note of tense and evil expectancy. Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the three figures as standing on the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but at a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising its hand above its head at rhythmic intervals, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstance, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from the distance, as if a loud chant were accompanying the gestures. The weird silhouette on that remote peak must have been a spectacle of infinite grotesqueness and impressiveness, but no observer was in a mood for aesthetic appreciation. "I guess he's saying the spell," whispered Wheeler as he snatched back the telescope. The whippoorwills were piping wildly and in a singularly curious, irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. Suddenly, the sunshine seemed to lessen without the intervention of any discernible cloud. It was a very peculiar phenomenon, and was plainly marked by all. A rumbling sound seemed brewing beneath the hills, mixed strangely with a concordant rumbling, which clearly came from the sky. Lightning flashed aloft, and the wondering crowd looked in vain for the portents of storm. The chanting of the men from Arkham now became unmistakable, and Wheeler saw through the glass.
Wait, is this where Batman got Arkham Asylum?
Incantation. From some farmhouse far away came the frantic barking of dogs. The change in the quality of the daylight increased, and the crowd gazed about the horizon in wonder. A purplish darkness, born of nothing more than a spectral deepening of the sky's blue, pressed down upon the rumbling hills. Then the light flashed again, somewhat brighter than before, and the crowd fancied that it had showed a certain mistiness around the altar stone on the distant height. No one, however, had been using the telescope at that instant. The whippoorwills continued their irregular pulsation, and the men of Dunwich braced themselves tensely against some imponderable menace with which the atmosphere seemed surcharged. Without warning came those deep, cracked, raucous vocal sounds which will never leave the memory of the stricken group who heard them. Not from any human throat were they born, for the organs of man can yield no such acoustic perversions. Rather would one have said they came from the pit itself, had not their source been so unmistakably the altar stone on the peak. It is almost erroneous to call them sounds at all, since so much of their ghastly, infrabass timbre spoke to dim seeds of consciousness and terror far subtler than the ear. Yet one must do so, since their form was indisputably, though vaguely, that of half-articulate words. They were loud as the rumblings and the thunder above which they echoed. Yet did they come from no visible thing, and because imagination might suggest a conjectural source in the world of non-visible beings, the huddled crowd at the mountain's base huddled still closer and winced, as if in expectation of a blow. Rang hideous croaking out of space. The speaking impulse seemed to falter here, as if some frightful psychic struggle were going on. Henry Wheeler strained his eye at the telescope, but saw only the three grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously in strange gestures as their incantation drew near its culmination. From what black wells of acherontic fear or feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness or obscure, long-latent heredity, were those half-articulate thunder-croakings drawn? Presently, they began to gather renewed force and coherence as they grew in stark, utter, ultimate frenzy.
It's missing something. It's not perfect. But I've learned for next time.
But that was all. The pallid group in the road, still reeling at the indisputable English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down from the frantic vacancy beside that shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report, which seemed to rend the hills, the deafening, cataclysmic peal whose source, be it inner earth or sky, no hearer was ever able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone. And a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetter that seemed about to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance, green grass and foliage wilted to a curious sickly yellow-gray, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. To this day there is something queer and unholy about the growths on and around that fearsome hill. Curtis Watley was only just regaining consciousness when the Archimedes came slowly down the mountain in the beams of a sunlight once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet, and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those which had reduced the group of natives to a state of cowed quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact. "The thing is gone forever," Armitage said. "It has been split up into what it was originally made of and can never exist again. It was an impossibility in a normal world. Only the least fraction was really matter in any sense we know. It was like its father, and most of it has gone back to him in some vague realm or dimension outside our material universe. Some vague abyss out of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could ever have called him for a moment on the hills." There was a brief silence, and in that pause the scattered senses of poor Curtis Watley began to knit back into a sort of continuity, so that he put his hands to his head with a moan. Memory seemed to pick itself up where it had left off, and the horror of the sight that had prostrated him burst in upon him again. Oh my God, that face on top of it. Oh, that face with the red eyes and crinkly albino hair, no chin, like the Watleys. It was octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing. But there was a half-shaped man's face on top of it and it looked like Wizard Watley's, only it was yards across. He paused, exhausted, as the whole group of natives stared in a bewilderment not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Watley, who wonderingly remembered ancient things, but who had been silent heretofore, spoke aloud. 15 years gone, he rambled. I heard old Watley say as how someday we'd hear a child of Lavinia's a-calling its father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill. But Joe Osborne interrupted him to question the Arkham man anew. What was it anyhow? And however did young Wizard Watley call it out of the air it come from? Armitage chose his words very carefully. It was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. A kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever tried to. There was some of it in Wilbur Watley himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him. And
I'm gonna call that done.
Pretty terrible
What do you think?
I'm going to burn the cursed diary And if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Watleys were so fond of. The beings they were going to let in tangibly, wipe out the human race, and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose.
It came out
As to
all
the
right.
thing we've just sent
I'm
back,
kinda liking that. What do you think?
the Watleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big, for the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big. But it beat it because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother.
Oh.
But it looked more like a father than he did.
I don't know what sort of roots. Could paint this one up. I want to do something different. Should pick up this mess and just put it in a bag so it doesn't get stained. Am I going to? Probably not. These are some of the flowers that my aunt gave me when I was a baby and was born.
Shake and win millions
So
of
lovely.
prizes with the AliExpress $1 challenge.
Using them a little bit, but oops, I forgot you were dying. Sorry.
Get unreal deals for just $1.
Whatever.
Win $10,000 in flight credits and a $3,000 AliExpress shopping spree.
Had a ballet. Now start drawing. Alright. It's a little bit more organized. Alright. What are we doing now?
Hello again.
A Hunter of the Dark.
Horrible.
Lovecraft. Alright, more racist.
Once again, we'll be delving into the Cthulhu mythos,
There we go.
dedicated to Mr. Robert Bloch. This is The Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft. As always, I hope you enjoy it. The Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft. I have seen the dark universe yawning, where the black planets roll without aim, where they roll in their horror, unheeded, without nemesis. Cautious investigators will hesitate to challenge the common belief that Robert Blake was killed by lightning, or by some profound nervous shock derived from an electrical discharge. It is true that the window he faced was unbroken, but nature has shown herself capable of many freakish performances. The expression on his face may easily have arisen from some obscure muscular source, unrelated to anything he saw, while the entries in his diary are clearly the result of a fantastic imagination, aroused by certain local superstitions, by certain old matters he had uncovered. As for the anomalous conditions at the deserted church on Federal Hill, the shrewd analyst is not slow in attributing them to some charlatan, conscious or unconscious, with at least some of which Blake was secretly connected. After all, the victim was a writer and painter, wholly devoted to the field of myth, dream, terror, and superstition, and avid in his quest for scenes and effects of a bizarre, spectral sort. His earliest stay in the city, a visit to a strange old man as deeply given to occult and forbidden lore as he, had ended amidst death and flame, and it must have been some morbid instinct which drew him back from his home in Milwaukee. He may have known of the old stories despite his statements to the contrary in the diary, and his death may have nipped in the bud some stupendous hoax destined to have a literary reflection. Among those, however, who have examined and correlated all this evidence, there remain several who cling to less rational and commonplace theories. They are inclined to take much of Blake's diary at its face value, and point significantly to certain facts such as the undoubted genuineness of the old church record, the verified existence of the disliked and unorthodox Starry Wisdom sect prior to 1877, the recorded disappearance of an inquisitive reporter named Edwin M. Lutridge in 1893, and, above all, the look of monstrous transfiguring fear on the face of the young writer when he died. It was one of these believers who, moved to fanatical extremes, threw into the bay the curiously angled stone and its strangely adorned metal box found in the old church steeple, the black windowless steeple, and not the tower where Blake's diary said those things originally
white
were.
versus like a primer.
Though widely censured both officially and unofficially, this man, a reputable physician with a taste for haute folklore, averred that he had rid the earth of something too dangerous to rest upon it. Between these two schools of opinion, the reader must judge for himself. The papers have given the tangible details from a skeptical angle, leaving for others the drawing of the picture as Robert Blake saw it, or thought he saw it, or pretended to see it. Now, studying the very closely, dispassionately, and at leisure, let us summarize the dark chain of events from the expressed point of view of their chief actor. Young Blake returned to Providence in the winter of 1934-35, taking the upper floor of a venerable dwelling in a grassy court off College Street, on the crest of the Great Eastwood Hill near the Brown University campus and behind the marble John Hay Library. It was a cozy and fascinating place.
I like to be able to write like this.
A garden oasis of village-like antiquity, where huge, friendly cats sunned themselves atop a convenient shed. The square Georgian house had a monitor roof, classic doorway with fan carving, small-paned windows, and all the other earmarks of early 19th century workmanship. Inside were 6 paneled doors, wide floorboards, a curving colonial staircase, white Adam period mantels, and a rear set of rooms 3 steps below the general level. Blake's study, a large southwest chamber, overlooked the front garden on one side, while its west windows, before one of which he had his desk, faced off from the brow of the hill and commanded a splendid view of the lower town's outspread roofs and of the mystical sunsets that flamed behind them. On the far horizon were the open countryside's purple slopes. Against these, some 2 miles away, rose the spectral hump of Federal Hill, bristling with huddled roofs and steeples whose remote outlines wavered mysteriously, taking fantastic forms as the smoke of the city swirled up and enmeshed them. Blake had a curious sense that he was looking upon some unknown, ethereal world, which might or might not vanish in dream if ever he tried to seek it out and enter it in person. Having sent home for most of his books, Blake bought some antique furniture suitable to his quarters and settled down to write and paint, living alone and attending to the simple housework himself. His studio was in a north attic room where the panes of the monitor roof furnished ample lighting. During that first winter, he produced 5 of his best-known short stories: The Burrower Beneath, The Stairs in the Crypt, Shag-Eye, in the Vale of Death, and The Feaster from
Are you
the
saying
Stars.
that I bought a lot of these? I did.
7 canvases.
It took me forever to figure out what I'm going to do with them.
Human monsters and
I'm busy.
non-terrestrial landscapes.
Actually, I'm going to step out for a minute, call my mom, use the bathroom, grab something to eat, and I'll be back. I shouldn't be long. If anything catches on fire, scream. downstairs making a mess. What are you up to? Awesome. I finished assembling all the fairies. I got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. I just need to clean their domes tomorrow and attach their domes and they'll be ready. I made something new. I did. I mean, I like it. I'm sure somebody else will like it, but yeah. I didn't ask her for it to ask. But I mean, it was done that quick. Yeah. Alright, just transmission. I'm sure it's nothing important. No. Night, love you too. Alright. Let's do another one.
At sunset, he would often sit at his desk, gaze dreamily off at the outspread west. Towers of the memorial hall just below, the Georgian courthouse belfry, the lost century with the downtown settlement, and a shimmering, spire-crowned mound. In the distance, from his few local acquaintances, he learned that the far-off slope was a vast Italian quarter, though most of the houses were remnants of older Yankee and Irish days. Now and then, he would train his field glasses on that spectral, unreachable world beyond the curling smoke, seeking out individual roofs, chimneys, and steeples, speculating upon the bizarre and curious mysteries they might house. Even with optical aid, Federal Hill seemed somehow alien, half-fabulous, and linked to the unreal, intangible marvels of Blake's own tales and pictures. The feeling would persist long after the hill had faded into the violet, lamp-starred twilight, and the courthouse floodlights and the red industrial trust beacon blazed up to make the night grotesque. Of all the distant objects on Federal Hill, a certain huge, dark church most fascinated Blake. It stood out with a special distinctness at certain hours of the day, and at sunset, the great tower and tapering steeple loomed blackly against the flaming sky. It seemed to rest on especially high ground. The grimy facade and the obliquely seen north side, with sloping roof and the tops of great pointed windows, rose boldly above the tangle of surrounding ridgepoles and chimney pots. Peculiarly grim and austere, appeared to be built of stone, stained and weathered with the smoke and storms of a century and more. The style, so far as the glass could shew, was that earliest experimental form of Gothic revival, which preceded the stately Upjohn period and held over some of the outlines and proportions of the Georgian age. Perhaps it was reared around 1810 or 1815. As months passed, Blake watched the far-off, forbidding structure with an oddly mounting interest. Since the vast windows were never lighted, he knew that it must be vacant. The longer he watched, the more his imagination worked, till at length he began to fancy curious things. He believed that a vague, singular aura of desolation hovered over the place, so that even the pigeons and swallows shunned its smoky eaves. Around other towers and belfries, his glass would reveal great flocks of birds, but here they never rested. At least, that is what he thought, and set down in his diary. He pointed the place out to several friends, but none of them had even been on Federal Hill, or possessed the faintest notion of what the church was or had been. In the spring, a deep restlessness gripped Blake. He had begun his long-planned novel, based on a supposed survival of the witch cult in Maine, but was strangely unable to make progress with it. More and more he would sit at his westward window and gaze at the distant hill and the black, frowning steeple shunned by the birds. When the delicate leaves came out on the garden boughs, the world was filled with a new beauty, but Blake's restlessness was merely increased. It was then that he first thought of crossing the city and climbing bodily up that fabulous slope into the smoke-wreathed world of dream. Late in April, just before the eon-shadowed Valpurgis time, Blake made his first trip into the unknown. Plodding through the endless downtown streets and the bleak, decayed squares beyond, he came finally upon the
Ooh, I just had
ascending
deja
avenue of
vu.
century-worn steps, sagging Doric porches, and blear-paned cupolas which he felt must lead up to the long-known, unreachable world beyond the mists. There were dingy blue and white street signs which meant nothing to him, and presently he noted the strange dark faces of the drifting crowds, and the foreign signs over curious shops in brown, decade-weathered buildings. Nowhere did he find any of the objects he had seen from afar, so that once more he half fancied that the federal of that distant view was a dream world, never to be trod by living feet. Now and then, a battered church facade or crumbling spire came in sight, but never the blackened pile that he sought. When he asked a shopkeeper about a great stone church, the man smiled and shook his head, though he spoke English freely. As Blake climbed higher, the region seemed stranger and stranger, with bewildering mazes of brooding brown alleys leading eternally off to the south. He crossed 2 or 3 broad avenues, and once thought he glimpsed a familiar tower. Again, he asked a merchant about the massive church of stone, and this time he could have sworn that the plea of ignorance was feigned. The dark man's face had a look of fear, which he tried to hide, and Blake saw him make a curious sign with his right hand. Then, suddenly, the black spire stood out against the cloudy sky on his left, above the tiers of brown roofs lining the tangled southerly alleys. Blake knew at once what it was, and plunged toward it, through the squalid, unpaved lanes that climbed from the avenue. Twice he lost his way, but he somehow dared not ask any of the patriarchs or housewives who sat on their doorsteps, or any of the children who shouted and played in the mud of the shadowy lanes. At last, he saw the tower plain against the southwest, and a huge stone bulk rose darkly at the end of an alley. Presently, he stood in a windswept, open square, quaintly cobblestoned, with a high bank wall on the farther side. This was the end of his quest, for upon the wide, iron-railed, weed-grown plateau which the wall supported, a separate, lesser world raised fully 6 feet above the surrounding streets, there stood a Titan bulk, whose identity, despite Blake's new perspective, was beyond dispute. The vacant church was in a state of great decrepitude. Some of the high stone buttresses had fallen, and several delicate finials lay half lost among the brown, neglected weeds and grasses. The sooty Gothic windows were largely unbroken, though many of the stone mullions were missing. Blake wondered how the obscurely painted panes could have survived so well in view of the known habits of small boys the world over. The massive doors were intact and tightly closed. Around the top of the bank wall, fully enclosing the grounds, was a rusty iron fence whose gate, at the head of a flight of steps in the square, was visibly padlocked. The path from the gate to the building was completely overgrown. Desolation and decay hung like a pall above the place, and in the birdless eaves and black, eyeless walls, Blake felt a touch of the dimly sinister beyond his power to define. There were very few people in the square, but Blake sought the leader at the north lead and approached him with questions about the church. It was a great post and it seemed odd that he would do little more than make the sign of the cross and mutter that people never spoke of that building. When Blake pressed him, he said very hurriedly that the Italian priests warned everybody against it, vowing that a monstrous evil had once dwelt there and left its mark. He himself had heard dark whispers of it from his father, who recalled certain sounds and rumors from his boyhood. There had been a bad sect there in the old days, an outlaw sect that called up awful things from some unknown gulf of midnight. It had taken a good priest to exorcise what had come. There did be those who said that merely the light could do it. If Father O'Malley were alive, there would be many to think he could tell. But now there was nothing to do but let it alone. It hurt nobody now, and those that...
Be right back. Just freaking myself out, I'm fine. Oh, I need to get a cat. If anybody can see all this, probably not. And I ripped that down in a fit of rage. Let's see how far you stretch. Well, about as good as I'm gonna get it, I think. Alright. I want to paint eyes. Why are there so many teeth?
Talking 77, when people began to find the works vanish now and then in the neighborhood. Someday the city would step in and take the property for lack of heirs, but little good would come of anybody's touching it. Better it be left alone for the years to topple, lest things be stirred that ought to rest forever in their black abyss. After the policeman had gone, Blake stood staring at the sullen, steepled pile. It excited him to find that the structure seemed as sinister to others as to him, and he wondered what grain of truth might lie behind the old tales the Bluecoat had repeated. Probably they were mere legends hurt by the evil look of the place, but even so, they were like a strange coming to light of one of his own stories. The afternoon sun came out from behind dispersing clouds, but seemed unable to light up the stained, sooty walls of the old temple that towered on its high plateau. It was odd that the green of spring could not touch the brown, withered growths in the raised, iron-fenced yard. Blake found himself edging nearer the raised area and examining the bank wall and rusted fence for possible avenues of ingress. There was a
6 each of 3, so 3, 6, 9, 12. Enough. I've enough of them. Good.
The fence had no opening in the steps.
Alright, that's all for today.
Outside was some
Now I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do with this.
He could go up the steps and walk around on
Make
the
it a
narrow
monster, of course.
outside the fence till he came to the gap. If the people feared the place so wildly, he would encounter no interference. He was on the embankment and almost inside the fence before anyone noticed him. Then, looking down, he saw the few people in the square edging away and making the same sign with their right hands that the shopkeeper in the avenue had made. Several windows were slammed down, and a fat woman darted into the street and pulled some small children inside a rickety, unpainted house. The gap in the fence was very easy to pass through, and before long, Blake found himself wading amidst the rotting, tangled growths of the deserted yard. Here and there, a worn stump of a headstone told him that there had once been burials in this field, but that, he saw, must have been very long ago. The sheer bulk of the church was oppressive now that he was close to it. He conquered his mood and approached to try the 3 great doors in the facade. All was securely locked, so he began a search of the Cyclopean building in quest of some minor and more penetrable opening. Even then, he was not sure that he could enter that form of desertion and shadow, but the pull of its strings dragged him. Unprotected cellar window in the rear of the unheated aperture. Here again, Blake saw a afternoon
go.
filled with cobwebs and dust, faintly lit by the western sun's filtered rays. Debris, old barrels and ruined boxes and furniture of numerous sorts met his eye, though over everything lay a shroud of dust, which softened all sharp outlines. The rusted remains of a hot air furnace showed that the building had been used and kept in shape as late as mid-Victorian times. Acting almost without conscious initiative, Blake crawled through the window and let himself down to the dust-carpeted, debris-strewn floor. The vaulted cellar was a vast one, without partitions, and in a corner far to the right, amid dense shadows, he saw a black archway, evidently leading upstairs. He felt a peculiar sense of oppression at being actually within the great spectral building, but kept it in check as he cautiously scouted about, finding a still intact barrel amid the dust, and rolling it over to the open window to provide for his exit. Then, bracing himself, he crossed the wide, cobweb-festooned space toward the arch, half choked with the omnipresent dust, and covered with ghostly gossamer fibers. He reached and began to climb the worn stone steps, which rose into the darkness. He had no light, but groped carefully with his hands. After a sharp turn, he felt a closed door ahead, and a little fumbling revealed its ancient latch. It opened inward, and beyond it, he saw a dimly illumined corridor lined with worm-eaten paneling. Once on the ground floor, Blake began exploring in a rapid fashion. All the inner doors were unlocked, so that he freely passed from room to room. The colossal nave was an almost eldritch place, with its drifts and mountains of dust over box pews, altar, hourglass pulpit, and sounding board, and its titanic ropes of cobweb stretching among the pointed arches of the gallery and entwining the clustered Gothic columns. Over all this hushed desolation played a hideous leaden light as the declining afternoon sun sent its rays through the strange, half-blackened panes of the great apsidal windows. The paintings on those windows were so obscured by soot that Blake could scarcely decipher what they had represented, but from the little he could make out, he did not like them. The designs were largely conventional, and his knowledge of obscure symbolism told him much concerning some of the ancient patterns. The few saints depicted bore expressions
I don't know what I'm
distinctly
doing.
open to criticism.
I think I'm just playing for the rest of the night.
Seemed to chew merely a dark space with spirals of curious luminosity scattered about in it. Turning away from the windows, Blake noticed that the cobweb cross above the altar was not of the ordinary kind, but resembled the primordial Ak, or Crux Ansata, of shadowy Egypt. In a rear vestry room beside the lamps, Blake found a rotting desk and ceiling-high shelves of mildewed, disintegrating books. Here, for the first time, he received a positive shock of objective horror. The titles of those books told him much. They were the black, forbidden things which most sane people have never even heard of, or have heard of only in furtive, timorous whispers. The banned and dreaded repositories of equivocal secrets and immemorial formulae, which have trickled down the stream of time from the days of man's youth and the dim, fabulous days before man was.
Oh,
He
there's
had
nobody there.
himself read many of them. A Latin version of the abhorred Necronomicon, the sinister Liber Avonis, the infamous Culte de Ghouls of Comte de Let, the unosprechelichen Culten of von Janst, and old Ludwig Prinz Hellish de Vermis Mysteris. But there were others he had known, merely by reputation or not at all. The narcotic manuscripts, the Book of Zian, and a crumbling volume in wholly unidentifiable characters, yet with certain symbols and diagrams shudderingly recognizable to the occult student. Clearly, the lingering local rumors had not lied. This place had once been the seat of an evil older than mankind and wider than the known universe. In the ruined desk was a small leather-bound record book filled with entries in some odd cryptographic medium. The manuscript writing consisted of the common traditional symbols used today in astronomy and anciently in alchemy astrology, and other dubious arts, the devices of the sun, moon, planets, aspects, and zodiacal signs. He amassed in solid pages of text, with divisions and paragraphing suggesting that each symbol answered to some alphabetical letter. In the hope of later solving the cryptogram, Blake bore off this volume in his coat pocket. Many of the great tomes on the shelves fascinated him unutterably, and he felt tempted to borrow them at some later time. He wondered how they could have remained undisturbed so long. Was he the first to conquer the clutching, pervasive fear which had for nearly 60 years protected this deserted place from visitors? Having now thoroughly explored the ground floor, Blake plowed again through the dust of the spectral nave to the front vestibule, where he had seen a door and staircase, presumably leading up to the blackened tower and steeple, objects so long familiar to him at a distance. The ascent was a choking experience. The dust lay thick, while the spiders had done their worst in this restricted place. The staircase was a spiral with high, narrow wooden treads, and now and then Blake passed a clouded window, looking dizzily out over the city. Though he had seen no ropes below, he expected to find a bell or peal of bells in the tower, whose narrow, louver-boarded lancet windows his field glass had studied so often. Here, he was doomed to disappointment. When he attained the top of the stairs, he found the tower chamber vacant of chimes, and clearly devoted to vastly different purposes. The room, about 15 feet square, was faintly lighted by 4 lancet windows, one on each side, which were glazed within their screening of decayed louver boards. These had been further fitted with tight, opaque screens, but the latter were now largely rotted away. In the center of the dust-laden floor rose a curiously angled stone pillar some 4 feet in height and 2 in average diameter, covered on each side with bizarre, crudely incised and wholly unrecognizable hieroglyphs. On this pillar rested a metal box of peculiarly asymmetrical form, its hinged lid thrown back, and its interior holding what looked beneath the decade-deep dust to be an egg-shaped or irregularly spherical object, some 4 inches through. Around the pillar in a rough circle were 7 high-backed Gothic chairs, largely intact, while behind them, ranging along the dark-paneled walls, were 7 colossal images of crumbling black painted plaster, resembling more than anything else the cryptic carven megaliths of mysterious Easter Island. In one corner of the cobweb chamber, a ladder was built into the wall, leading up to the closed trapdoor of the windowless steeple above. As Blake grew accustomed to the feeble light, he noticed odd bas-reliefs on the strange open box of yellowish metal. Approaching, he tried to clear the dust away with his hands and handkerchief, and saw that the figurines were of a monstrous and utterly alien kind, depicting entities which, though seemingly alive, resembled no known life form ever evolved on this planet.
The Foundation.
4-inch seeming sphere turned out to be a nearly black, red striated polyhedron with many irregular flat surfaces, either a very remarkable crystal of some sort or an artificial object of carved and highly polished mineral matter. It did not touch the bottom of the box, but was held suspended by means of a metal band around its center, with 7 queerly designed supports extending horizontally to angles of the box's inner wall near the top. The stone, once exposed, exerted upon Blake an almost alarming fascination. He could scarcely tear his eyes from it, and as he looked at its glistening surfaces, he almost fancied it was transparent, with half-formed worlds of wonder within. Into his mind floated pictures of alien orbs with great stone towers, and other orbs with titan mountains and no mark of life, and still remoter spaces where only a stirring in vague blacknesses told of the presence of consciousness and will. When he did look away, it was to notice a somewhat singular mound of dust in the far corner, near the ladder to the steeple. Just why it took his attention he could not tell. but something in its contours carried a message to his unconscious mind. Plowing toward it, and brushing aside the hanging cobwebs as he went, he began to discern something grim about it, and an handkerchief soon revealed the truth, and Blake gasped at the baffling mixture of emotions. It was a human skeleton, and it must have been there for a very long time. The clothing was in shreds, but some buttons and fragments of cloth bespoke a man's grey suit. There were other bits of evidence: shoes, metal clasps, huge buttons for round cuffs, a stick pin of bygone pattern, a reporter's badge with the name of the old Providence Telegram, and a crumbling leather pocketbook. Blake examined the latter with care, finding within it several bills of antiquated issue, a celluloid advertising calendar for 1893, some cards with the name Edwin M. Lillibridge, and a paper covered with penciled memoranda. This paper held much of a puzzling nature, and Blake read it carefully through the dim westward window. Its disjointed text included such phrases as the following: Professor Enoch Bowen, home from Egypt, May 1844, buys old Free Will Church in July. His archaeological work and studies in occult, well known. Dr. Drown of Fourth Baptist warns against starry wisdom in sermon, December 29th, 1844. Congregation 97, by end of 45. 1846, 3 disappearances, first mention of shining trapezahedron. 7 disappearances, 1848. Stories of blood sacrifice begin. Investigation 1853, comes to nothing. Stories of sounds. Father O'Malley tells of devil worship with box found in great Egyptian ruins. Says they call up something that can't exist in light. Flees a little light, but banished by strong light. Then has to be summoned again. Probably got this from deathbed confession of Francis X. Feeney, who had joined Starry Wisdom in 49. These people say the shining trapezahedron shews them heaven and other worlds, that the haunter of the dark tells them secrets in some way. Story of Oren B. Eddy, 1857. They call it up by gazing at the crystal and have a secret language of their own. 200 or more in congregation, 1863, exclusive of men at front. Irish boys mobbed church in 1869 after Patrick Reagan's disappearance. Veiled article in J, March 14th, 72, but people don't talk about it. 6 disappearances, 1876. Secret committee calls on Mayor Doolittle. Action promised February 1877. Church closes in April. Gang, Federal Hillboys, threaten a doctor and vestryman in May. 181 persons leave city before end of 77. Mention no names. Ghost stories begin around 1880. Try to ascertain truth of report that no human being has entered church since 1877. Ask Lanigan for photograph of place, taken 1851.
Board employee pricing is here, but not for long.
Restoring the paper to the pocketbook and placing the latter in his coat, Blake turned to look down at the skeleton in the dust. The implications of the notes were clear, and there could be no doubt but that this man had come to the deserted edifice 42 years before in quest of a newspaper sensation which no one else had been bold enough to attempt. Perhaps no one else had known of his plan. Who could tell? But he had never returned to his paper. Had some bravely suppressed fear risen to overcome him and bring on sudden heart failure? Blake stooped over the gleaming bones and noted their peculiar state. Some of them were badly scattered, and a few seemed oddly dissolved at the ends. Others were strangely yellowed, with vague suggestions of charring. This charring extended to some of the fragments of clothing. The skull was in a very peculiar state, stained yellow and with a charred aperture in the top, as if some powerful acid had eaten through the solid bone. What had happened to the skeleton during its 4 decades of silent entombment here, Blake could not imagine. Before he realized it, he was looking at the stone again, and letting its curious influence call up a nebulous pageantry in his mind. He saw processions of robed, hooded figures whose outlines were not human, and looked on endless leagues of desert lined with carved, sky-reaching monoliths. He saw towers and walls in nighted depths under the sea, and vortices of space where wisps of black mist floated before thin shimmerings of cold, purple haze. And beyond all else, he glimpsed an infinite gulf of darkness. The solid and semi-solid forms were known only by their windy stirrings. Cloudy patterns of force seemed to superimpose order on chaos and hold forth a key to all the paradoxes and arcana of the worlds we know. Then all at once the spell was broken by an access of gnawing, indeterminate panic fear. Blake choked and turned away from the stone, conscious of some formless alien presence close to him, watching him with horrible intentness. He felt entangled with something which was not in the stone, but which had looked through it at him, something which would ceaselessly follow him with a cognition that was not physical sight. Plainly, the place was getting on his nerves, as well it might, in view of his gruesome find. The light was waning too, and since he had no illuminant with him, he knew he would have to be leaving soon. It was then, in the gathering twilight, that he thought he saw a faint trace of luminosity in the crazily angled stone. He had tried to look away from it, but some obscure compulsion drew his eyes back. Was there a subtle phosphorescence of radioactivity about the thing? What was it that the dead man's notes had said concerning a shining trapezohedron? What, anyway, was this abandoned lair of cosmic evil? What had been done here? And what might still be lurking in the bird-shunned shadows? It seemed now as if an elusive touch of fetor had arisen somewhere close by. Though its source was not apparent, Blake seized the cover of the long open box and snapped it down. It moved easily on its alien hinges and closed completely over the unmistakably glowing stone. At the sharp click of that closing, a soft stirring sound seemed to come from the steeple's eternal blackness overhead beyond the trapdoor. Rats, without question. The only living things to reveal their presence in this accursed pile since he had entered it. And yet, that stirring in the steeple frightened him horribly, so that he plunged almost wildly down the spiral stairs.
Hi, Grace. You still there? Probably not.
To the vaulted basement, out amidst the gathering dusk of the deserted square, and down through the teeming, fear-haunted alleys and avenues of Federal Hill, toward the sane central streets and the home-like brick sidewalks of the college district.
How you doing
During the
tonight?
days which followed, Blake told no one of his expedition. Instead, he read much in certain books, examined long years of newspaper files downtown, and worked feverishly at the cryptogram in that leather volume from the cobwebbed vestry room. The cipher, he soon saw, was no simple one, and after a long period of endeavor, he felt sure that its language could not be English, Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, Italian, or German. Evidently, he would have to draw upon the deepest wells of his strange erudition. Every evening, the old impulse to gaze westward returned, and he saw the black steeple as of yore amongst the bristling roofs of a distant and half-fabulous world. But now it held a fresh note of terror for him. He knew the heritage of evil lore it masked, and with the knowledge his vision ran riot in queer new ways. The birds of spring were returning, and as he watched their sunset flights, he fancied they avoided the gaunt, lone spire as never before. When a flock of them approached it, he thought, they would wheel and scatter in panic confusion, and he could guess at the wild twitterings which failed to reach him across the intervening miles. It was in June that Blake's diary told of his victory over the cryptogram. The text was, he found, in the dark Aklo language used by certain cults of evil antiquity, and known to him in a halting way through previous researches. The diary is strangely reticent about what Blake deciphered, but he was patently awed and disconcerted by his results. There are references to a haunter of the dark, awaked by gazing into the shining trapezahedron, and insane conjectures about the black gulfs of chaos from which it was called. The being is spoken of as holding all knowledge, demanding monstrous sacrifices. Some of Blake's entries shew fear lest the thing which he seemed to regard as summoned stalk abroad, though he adds that the streetlights form a bulwark which cannot be crossed. Of the shining trapezahedron he speaks often, calling it a window on all time and space, and tracing its history from the days it was fashioned in dark Yuggoth, before ever the old ones brought it to earth. It was treasured and placed in its curious box by the crinoid things of Antarctica, salvaged from their ruins by the serpent men of Volusia, and peered at eons later in Lemuria by the first human beings. It crossed strange lands and stranger seas, and sank with Atlantis before a Minoan fisher meshed it in his net and sold it to swarthy merchants from knighted Kem. The pharaoh Nefrenkar built around it a temple with a windowless crypt, and did that which caused his name to be stricken from all monuments and records. Then it slept in the ruins of that evil fane, which the priests and the new pharaoh destroyed, till the delver's spade once more brought it forth to curse mankind. Early in July, the newspapers oddly supplement Blake's entries, though in so brief and casual a way that only the diary has called general attention to their contribution. It appears that the new fear had been growing on Federal Hill since a stranger had entered the dreaded church. The Italians whispered of unaccustomed stirrings and bumpings and scrapings in the dark windowless steeple, and called on their priests to banish an entity which haunted their dreams. Something, they said, was constantly watching at the door to see if it were dark enough to venture forth. Press items mentioned the long-standing local superstitions, but failed to shed much light on the earlier background of the horror. It was obvious that the young reporters of today are no antiquarians. In writing of these things in his diary, Blake expresses a curious kind of remorse, and talks of the duty of burying the shining trapezahedron and of banishing what he had evoked by letting daylight into the hideous jutting spire. At the same time, however, he displays the dangerous extent of his fascination, and admits a morbid longing, pervading even his dreams, to visit the accursed tower and gaze again into the cosmic secrets of the glowing stone. Then something in the journal on the morning of July 17th threw the diarist into a veritable fever of horror. It was only a variant of the other half-humorous items about the Federal Hill restlessness, but it was somehow very terrible indeed. In the night, a thunderstorm had put the city's lighting system out of commission for a full hour. In that black interval, the Italians had nearly gone mad with fright. Those living near the dreaded church had sworn that the thing in the steeple had taken advantage of the street lamp's absence and gone down into the body of the church, flopping and bumping around in a viscous, altogether dreadful way. Toward the last, it had bumped up to the tower, where there were sounds of the shattering of glass. It could go wherever the darkness reached, but the light would always send it fleeing. When the current blazed on again, there had been a shocking commotion in the tower, for even the feeble light trickling through the grime-blackened, louver-boarded windows was too much for the thing. It had bumped and slithered up into its tenebrous steeple just in time, for a long dose of light would have sent it back into the abyss, whence the crazy stranger had called it. During the dark hour, praying crowds had clustered round the church in the rain, with lighted candles and lamps somehow shielded with folded paper and umbrellas, God of light to save the city from the nightmare that stalks in darkness. Once, those nearest the church declared the outer door had rattled hideously. But even this was not the worst. That evening in the bulletin, Blake read of what the reporters had found. Aroused at last to the whimsical news value of the scare, a pair of them had defied the frantic crowds of Italians and crawled into the church through the cellar window after trying the doors in vain. They found the dust of the vestibule and of the spectral nave plowed up in a singular way, with bits of rotted cushions and satin pew linings scattered curiously around. There was a bad odor everywhere. Here and there were bits of yellow stain and patches of what looked like charring. Opening the door to the tower and pausing a moment with the suspicion of a scraping sound above, they found the narrow spiral stairs wiped roughly clean. In the tower itself, a similarly half-swept condition existed. They spoke of the heptagonal stone pillar, the overturned Gothic chairs, and the bizarre plaster images, though strangely enough, the metal box and the odd mutilated skeleton were not mentioned. What disturbed Blake the most, except for the hints of stains and charring and bad odors, was the final detail that explained the crashing glass. Every one of the tower's lancet windows was broken, and two of them had been darkened in a crude and hurried way by the stuffing of satin pew linings and cushion horsehair into the spaces between the slanting exterior louver boards. More satin fragments and bunches of horsehair lay scattered around the newly swept floor, as if someone had been interrupted in the act of restoring the tower to the absolute blackness of its tightly curtained days. Yellowish stains and charred patches were found on the ladder to the windowless spire, but when a reporter climbed up, opened the horizontally sliding trapdoor, and shot a feeble flashlight beam into the black and strangely fetid space, he saw nothing but darkness and a heterogeneous litter of shapeless fragments near the aperture. The verdict, of course, was charlatanry. Somebody had played a joke on the superstitious hill-dwellers, or else some fanatic had striven to bolster up their fears for their own supposed good. Or perhaps some of the younger and more sophisticated dwellers had staged an elaborate hoax on the outside world. There was an amusing aftermath when the police sent an officer to verify the reports. 3 men in succession found ways of evading the assignment, and the 4th went very reluctantly and returned very soon without adding to the account given by the reporters. From this point onward, Blake's diary shews a mounting tide of insidious horror and nervous apprehension. He upbraids himself for not doing something and speculates wildly on the consequences of another electrical breakdown. It has been verified that on 3 occasions during thunderstorms, he telephoned the electric light company in a frantic vein and asked that desperate precautions against the loss of power be taken. Now and then his entries shew concern over the failure of the reporters to find the metal box and stone, and the strangely marred old skeleton when they explored the shadowy tower room. He assumed that these things had been removed. Whither and by whom or what, he could only guess. But his worst fears concerned himself, and the kind of unholy rapport he felt to exist between his mind and that lurking horror in the distant steeple, that monstrous thing of night which his rashness had called out of the ultimate black spaces. He seemed to feel a constant tugging at his will, and callers of that period remember how he would sit abstractedly at his desk and stare out of the west window at that far-off, spire-bristling mound beyond the swirling smoke of the city. His entries dwell monotonously on certain terrible dreams, and of a strengthening of the unholy rapport in his sleep. There is mention of a night when he awaked to find himself fully dressed, outdoors, and headed automatically down College Hill toward the west. Again and again he dwells on the fact that the thing in the steeple knows where to find him. The week following July 30th is recalled as the time of Blake's partial breakdown. He did not dress and ordered all his food by telephone. Visitors remarked the cords he kept near his bed, and he said that sleepwalking had forced him to bind his ankles every night with knots, which would probably hold or else waken him with the labor of untying. In his diary, he told of the hideous experience which had brought the collapse. After retiring on the night of the 30th, he had suddenly found himself groping about in an almost black space. All he could see were short, faint, horizontal streaks of bluish light, but he could smell an overpowering fetor and hear a curious jumble of soft, furtive sounds above him. Whenever he moved, he stumbled over something, and at each noise, there would come a sort of answering sound from above, a vague stirring, mixed with a cautious sliding of wood on wood. Once, his groping hands encountered a pillar of stone with a vacant top, whilst later he found himself clutching the rungs of a ladder built into the wall, and fumbling his uncertain way upward towards some region of intenser stench where a hot, searing blast beat down against him. Before his eyes, a kaleidoscopic range of phantasmal images played, all of them dissolving at intervals into the picture of a vast, unplumbed abyss of night, wherein whirled suns and worlds of an even profounder blackness. He thought of the ancient legends of ultimate chaos, at whose center sprawls the blind idiot lord Azathoth, lord of all things, encircled by his flopping hood of mindless and amorphous
Okay, I'm gonna add
dancers,
purple to help myself.
by the thin, monotonous piping of a demoniac flute held in nameless pause. Then a sharp report from the outer world broke through his stupor and roused him to the unutterable horror of his position. What it was, he never knew. Perhaps it was some belated peal from the fireworks heard all summer on Federal Hill as the dwellers hailed their various patron saints, or the saints of their native villages in Italy. In any event, he shrieked aloud, dropped frantically from the ladder, and stumbled blindly across the obstructed floor of the almost lightless chamber that encompassed him. He knew instantly where he was, and plunged recklessly down the narrow spiral staircase, tripping and bruising himself at every turn. There was a nightmare flight through a vast cobwebbed nave, whose ghostly arches reached up to realms of leering shadow, a sightless scramble through a littered basement, a climb to regions of air and streetlights outside, and a mad racing down a spectral hill of gibbering gables, across a grim, silent city of tall black towers, and up the steep eastward precipice to his own ancient door. On regaining consciousness in the morning, he found himself lying on his study floor, fully dressed. Dirt and cobwebs covered him, and every inch of his body seemed sore and bruised. When he faced the mirror, he saw that his hair was badly scorched, while a trace of strange, evil odor seemed to cling to his upper, outer clothing. It was then that his nerves broke down. Thereafter, lounging exhaustedly about in a dressing gown, he did little but stare from his west window, shiver at the threat of thunder, and make wild entries in his diary. The great storm broke just before midnight on August 8th. Lightning struck repeatedly in all parts of the city, and 2 remarkable fireballs were reported. The rain was torrential, while a constant fusillade of thunder brought sleeplessness to thousands. Blake was utterly frantic in his fear for the lighting system, and tried to telephone the company around 1 a.m., though by that time service had been temporarily cut off in the interest of safety. He recorded everything in his diary, the large, nervous, and often undecipherable hieroglyphs telling their own story of growing frenzy and despair, and of entries scrawled blindly in the dark. He had to keep the house dark in order to see out the window, and it appears that most of his time was spent at his desk, peering anxiously through the rain, across the glistening miles of downtown roofs, at the constellation of distant lights marking Federal Hill. Now and then, he would fumblingly make an entry in his diary, so that detached phrases such as, "The lights must not go," "It knows where I am, I must destroy it," and "It is calling to me, but perhaps it means no injury this time, are found scattered down 2 of the pages. Then the lights went out all over the city. It happened at 2:12 a.m., according to Powerhouse records. But Blake's diary gives no indication of the time. The entry is merely, "Lights out. God help me." On Federal Hill, there were watchers as anxious as he, and rain-soaked knots of men paraded the square and alleys around the evil church with umbrella-shaded candles, electric flashlights, oil lanterns, crucifixes, and obscure charms of the many sorts common to southern Italy. They blessed each flash of lightning and made cryptical signs of fear with their right hands when a turn in the storm caused the flashes to lessen and finally to cease altogether. A rising wind blew out most of the candles so that the scene grew threateningly dark. Someone roused Father Maluzzo of Spirito Santo Church, and he hastened to the dismal square to pronounce whatever helpful syllables he could. Of the restless and curious sounds in the blackened tower, there could be no doubt whatever. For what happened at 2:35, we have the testimony of the priest, a young, intelligent, and well-educated person, of Patrolman William J. Monaghan of the Central Station, an officer of the highest reliability, who had paused at that part of his beat to inspect the crowd, and of most of the 78 men who had gathered around the church's high bank wall, especially those in the square, where the eastward facade was visible. Of course, there was nothing which can be proved as being outside the order of nature. The possible causes of such an event are many. No one can speak with certainty of the obscure chemical processes arising in a vast, ancient, ill-aired, and long-deserted building of heterogeneous contents. Mephitic vapors, spontaneous combustion, pressure of gases born of long decay, any one of numberless phenomena might be responsible. And then, of course, the factor of conscious charlatanry could by no means be excluded. The thing was really quite simple in itself, and covered less than 3 minutes of actual time. Father Maluzzo, always a precise man, looked at his watch repeatedly. It started with a definite swelling of the dull fumbling sounds inside the black tower. There had for some time been a vague exhalation of strange, evil odors from the church, and this had now become emphatic and offensive. Then at last there was a sound of splintering wood, and a large, heavy object crashed down in the yard beneath the frowning easterly facade. The tower was invisible now that the candles would not burn, but as the object neared the ground, the people knew that it was the smoke-grimed louverboarding of that tower's east window. Immediately afterward, an utterly unbearable fetor welled forth from the unseen heights, choking and sickening the trembling watchers, and almost prostrating those in the square. At the same time, the air trembled with a vibration as of flapping wings, and a sudden east-blowing wind, more violent than any previous blast, snatched off the hats and wrenched the dripping umbrellas of the crowd. Nothing definite could be seen in the candleless night, though some upward-looking spectators thought they glimpsed a great, spreading blur of denser blackness against the inky sky, something like a formless cloud of smoke that shot with meteor-like speed toward the east. That was all. The watchers were half numbed with fright, awe, and discomfort, and scarcely knew what to do, or whether to do anything at all. Not knowing what had happened, they did not relax their vigil, and a moment later they sent up a prayer as a sharp flash of belated lightning, followed by an ear-splitting crash of sound, rent the flooded heavens. Half an hour later, the rain stopped, and in 15 minutes more the street lights sprang on again, sending the weary, bedraggled watchers relievedly back to their homes. The next day's papers gave these matters minor mention in connection with the general storm reports. It seems that the great lightning flash and deafening explosion which followed the Federal Hill occurrence were even more tremendous farther east, where a burst of the singular fetor was likewise noticed. The phenomenon was most marked over College Hill, where the crash awaked all the sleeping inhabitants, and led to a bewildered round of speculations. Of those who were already awake, only a few saw the anomalous blaze of light near the top of the hill, or noticed the inexplicable upward rush of air, which almost stripped the leaves from the trees and blasted the plants in the gardens. It was agreed that the lone, sudden lightning bolt must have struck somewhere in this neighborhood.
Christmas red.
No trace of its striking could afterward be found. A youth in the Tower Mega Fraternity House thought he saw a grotesque and hideous mass of smoke in the air, just as the preliminary flash burst, but his observation has not been verified. All of the few observers, however, agree as to the violent gust from the west and the flood of intolerable stench which preceded the belated stroke, whilst evidence concerning the momentary burned odor after the stroke is equally general. These points were discussed very carefully because of their probable connection with the death of Robert Blake. Students in the Psi Delta house, whose upper rear windows looked into Blake's study, noticed the blurred white face at the westward window on the morning of the 9th, and wondered what was wrong with the expression. When they saw the same face in the same position that evening, they felt worried and watched for the lights to come up in his apartment. Later, they rang the bell of the darkened flat, and finally had a policeman force the door. The rigid body sat bolt upright at the desk by the window, and when the intruders saw the glassy, bulging eyes and the marks of stark, convulsive fright on the twisted features, they turned away, sick in dismay. Shortly afterward, the coroner's physician made an examination, and despite the unbroken window, reported electrical shock, or nervous tension induced by electrical discharge, as the cause of death. The hideous expression he ignored altogether, deeming it a not improbable result of the profound shock as experienced by a person of such abnormal imagination and unbalanced emotions.
Unbalanced emotions.
Qualities
Keeps
from
calling
the
a
books,
woman.
paintings, and manuscripts found in the apartment, and from the blindly scrawled entries in the diary on the desk. Blake had prolonged his frenzied jottings to the last, and the broken pointed pencil was found clutched in his spasmodically contracted right hand. The entries after the failure of the lights were highly disjointed and legible only in part. From them, certain investigators have drawn conclusions differing greatly from the materialistic official verdict, but such speculations have little chance for belief among the conservative. The case of these imaginative theorists has not been helped by the action of superstitious Dr. Dexter, who threw the curious box in angled stone, an object certainly self-luminous as seen in the black windowless steeple where it was found, into the deepest channel of Narragansett Bay. Excessive imagination and neurotic unbalance on Blake's part, aggravated by knowledge of the evil bygone cult, whose startling traces he had uncovered, formed the dominant interpretation, given those final frenzied jottings. These are the entries, or all that can be made of them. Lights still out. Must be 5 minutes now. Everything depends on lightning. Yadith granted will keep up. Some influence seems beating through it. Rain and thunder and wind deafen. The thing is taking hold of my mind. Trouble with memory. I see things I never knew before. Other worlds and other galaxies. Dark. The lightning seems dark and the darkness seems light. It cannot be the real hill and church that I see in the pitch darkness. Must be retinal impression left by flashes. Heaven grant the Italians are out with their candles if the lightning stops. What am I afraid of? Is it not an avatar of Nyarlathotep, who in antique and shadowy Ken even took the form of man? I remember Yuggoth, the more distant Shagai, and the ultimate void of the black planets. The long winging flight through the void cannot cross the universe of light, recreated by the thoughts caught in the shining trapezahedron, send it through the horrible abysses of radiance. My name is Blake, Robert Harrison Blake of 620 East Knapp Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I am on this planet. Azathoth, have mercy. The lightning no longer flashes. Horrible. I can see everything with a monstrous sense that is not sight. Light is dark, and dark is light. those people on the hill. God, candles and charms. They're priests. Sense of distance gone. Far is near, near is far. No light, no glass. See that steeple, that tower, window. Can hear Roderick Usher. Am mad or going mad. The thing is stirring and fumbling in the tower. I am it. It is I. I want to get out. Must get out and unify the forces. It knows where I am. I am Robert Blake, but I see the tower in the dark. There is a monstrous odor. The sense is transfigured. Boarding at that tower window, cracking and giving way. Ya, guy. I see it. Coming here. Hell wind, titan blur, black wings. Yog-Sothoth, save me. The three-lobed, burning eye.
To be so good at writing, so close to your death. Is that the actual end of it? Nice.
Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed this reading,
Not
and
bad.
would like to support our work here at Horror Babble, please feel free to pay us a visit over at Patreon. Links to Patreon and the Bandcamp shop can be found in the video description below. Until next time, goodbye.
It had a bit more of a different texture. If I don't like it, I can just paint over it.
Bank more encores when you switch to a Scotiabank banking package.
Yeah.
Learn more at scotiabank.com/banking packages. Conditions apply. Scotiabank, you're richer than you think.
Doubtful.
I feel I may have entirely misunderstood him. Is it too much to think that he might have done this all for me?
Pride and Prejudice. I'm gonna pass on that one. Fire. Let's see what's next. Cthulhu Mythos. Keep with that for a while. It's not complicated. It's like R.L. Stein and Goosebumps. When you first start reading, you love it. Then after like 5 or 6 books, you're like, shit, this is all the same.
Welcome to Horror Babble. Today I'll be reading another Cthulhu Mythos short story by American author Robert E. Howard. In a lost city in the deserts of the Middle East, the hunt for a rare gem is underway.
Of course it
in
is.
the Fire of Asabanopal. As always, we hope you enjoy this one. The Fire of Asabanopal by Robert E. Howard. Yar Ali squinted carefully down the blue barrel of his Lee Enfield, called devoutly on Allah, and sent a bullet through the brain of a flying rider. Allahu Akbar! The big Afghan shouted in glee, waving his weapon above his head. God is great. By Allah, Sahib, I have sent another one of the
Jesus,
dogs
I'm not sure if I
ahead."
can do this one. I don't know how
His
racist it
companion
is.
peered cautiously over the rim of the sandpit they had scooped with their hands. He was a lean and wiry American, Steve Cloney by name. Good work, old horse, said this person. Look, they're drawing off. The white-robed horsemen were indeed reining away, clustering together just out of accurate rifle range, as if in council. There had been 7 when they had first swooped down on the comrades, but the fire from the 2 rifles in the sandpit had been deadly. Look, Sahib, they abandoned the fray. Yar Ali stood up boldly and shouted taunts at the departing riders, one of whom whirled and sent a bullet that kicked up sand 30 feet in front of the pit. They shoot like the sons of dogs, said Yar Ali in complacent self-esteem. By Allah, did you see that rogue plunge from his saddle as my lead went home? Up, Sahib, let us run after them and cut them down. Paying no attention to this outrageous proposal, for he knew it was but one of the gestures Afghan nature continually demands, Steve rose, dusted off his breeches, and gazing after the riders, now white specks far out on the desert, said musingly, "Those fellows ride as if they had some set purpose in mind, not a bit like men running from a licking. Aye, agreed Yar Ali promptly, and seeing nothing inconsistent with his present attitude and recent bloodthirsty suggestion.
They ride after more of their kind. They are hawks who give up their prey not quickly. We'd best move our position quickly, Steve Sahib. They will come back. Maybe in a few hours, maybe in a few days. It all depends on how far away lies the oasis of their tribe. But they will be back. We have guns and lives. They want both. And behold,
The Afghan levered out the empty shell and slipped a single cartridge into the breech of his rifle.
my last bullet, Sahib.
Steve nodded. I've got 3 left. The raiders whom their bullets had knocked from the saddle had been looted by their own comrades. No use searching the bodies which lay in the sand for ammunition. Steve lifted his canteen and shook it. Not much water remained. He knew that Yar Ali had only a little more than he, though the big Afridi, bred in a barren land, had used and needed less water than did the American, although the latter, judged from a white man's standards, was hard and tough as a wolf. As Steve unscrewed the canteen cap and drank very sparingly, he mentally reviewed the chain of events that had led them to their present position. Wanderers, soldiers of fortune, thrown together by chance and attracted to each other by mutual admiration, he and Yar Ali had wandered from India up through Turkestan and down through Persia, an oddly assorted but highly capable pair. Driven by the restless urge of inherent wanderlust, their avowed purpose, which they swore to and sometimes believed themselves, was the accumulation of some vague and undiscovered treasure, some pot of gold at the foot of some yet unborn rainbow. Then, in ancient Shiraz, they had heard of the fire of Asabanopal, from the lips of an ancient Persian trader who only half believed what he repeated to them. They heard the tale that he in turn had heard from the babbling lips of delirium in his distant youth. He had been a member of a caravan 50 years before, which, wandering far on the southern shore of the Persian Gulf, trading for pearls, had followed the tale of a rare pearl far into the desert. The pearl, rumored found by a diver and stolen by a sheikh of the interior, they did not find, but they did pick up a Turk who was dying of starvation, thirst, and a bullet wound in the thigh. As he died in delirium, he babbled a wild tale of a silent, dead city of black stone, set in the drifting sands of the desert far to the westward, and of a flaming gem, clutched in the bony fingers of a skeleton, an ancient throne. He had not dared bring it away with him, because of an overpowering, brooding horror that haunted the place, and thirst had driven him into the desert again, where Bedouins had pursued and wounded him. Yet he had escaped, riding hard until his horse fell under him. He died without telling how he had reached the mythical city in the first place, for the old trader thought he must have come from the northwest, a deserter from the Turkish army, making a desperate attempt to reach the Gulf. The men of the caravan had made no attempt to plunge still further into the desert in search of the city, for, said the old trader, they believed it to be the ancient city of evil spoken of in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Al-Hazra, the city of the dead on which an ancient curse rested. Legends named
Alright,
vaguely.
the plan
The
is to
Arabs
let this
called it Bab
dry,
el-Jinn, the
and
city of devils, and
then
the
go
Turks,
with the black marker
Arashia, the Black City.
and doodle
The
details.
gem was that ancient and accursed jewel belonging to a king of long ago, whom the Grecians called Sardanapalus, and
This
the
is the
Semitic
idea.
peoples Asabanopal.
What time is it?
Steve had been fascinated
It's
by
only
the tale,
9:30. I don't want to stop
admitting to
now.
himself that it was doubtless one of the 10,000 cock and bull myths mooted about the East. Still, there was a possibility that he and Yar Ali had stumbled onto a trace of that pot of rainbow gold for which they searched. Yar Ali had heard hints before of a silent city of the sands. Tales had followed the eastbound caravans over the high Persian lands and across the sands of Turkestan, into the mountain country and beyond. Vague tales, whispers of a black city of the jinn, deep in the hazes of a haunted desert.
Right,
So,
it's down.
following the trail of the legend, the companions had come from Shiraz to a village on the Arabian shore of the Persian Gulf, and there had heard more from an old man who had been a pearl diver in his youth. The loquacity of age was on him. He told tales repeated to him by wandering tribesmen who had them in turn from the wild nomads of the deep interior. And again Steve and Yar Ali heard of the still black city with giant beasts carved of stone, and the skeleton sultan who held the blazing gem.
gonna leave that off, actually. What else do I have to work with? You need to be turned into something. Sorry. Got something in the toaster. I'll be right back. Ooh. Whew. I'm okay. Somehow. Oh God. Whew. Okay, I'm back. Because, you know, you can buy waffles frozen. So, I ate my waffles. They're good. So I don't think I'll be buying waffles anytime soon. Alright. We can give this a coat of white. Pink, I guess. Then we can move on from what we're doing.
And so, mentally swearing at himself for a fool, Steve had made the plunge, and Yar Ali, secure in the knowledge that all things lay on the lap of Allah, to come with him. Their scanty supply of money had been just sufficient to provide riding camels and provisions for a bold flying invasion of the unknown. Their only chart had been the vague rumors that placed the supposed location of Karasher. There had been days of hard travel, pushing the beasts and conserving water and food. Then, deep in the desert they invaded, they had encountered a blinding sand wind in which they had lost the camels. After that came long miles of staggering through the sands, battered by a flaming sun, subsisting on rapidly dwindling water from their canteens, and food Yar Ali had in a pouch. No thought of finding the mythical city now. They pushed on blindly, in hope of stumbling upon a spring. They knew that behind them no oases lay within a distance they could hope to cover on foot. It was a desperate chance, but their only one. Then white-clad hawks had swooped down on them, out of the haze of the skyline. And from a shallow and hastily scooped trench, the adventurers had exchanged shots with the wild riders who circled them at top speed. The bullets of the Bedouins had skipped through their makeshift fortifications, knocking dust into their eyes and flicking bits of cloth from their garments. But by good chance, neither had been hit. Their one bit of luck, reflected Barney, he cursed himself for a fool. What a mad venture it had been anyway. To think that two men could so dare the desert and live, much less wrest from its abysmal bosom the secrets of the ages. That crazy tale of a skeleton hand gripping a flaming jewel in a dead city? Bosh! What utter rot. He must have been crazy himself to credit it, the American decided with the clarity of view that suffering and danger bring. Well, old horse, said Steve, lifting his rifle, let's get going. It's a toss-up if we die of thirst or get sniped off by the Desert Brothers. Anyway, we're doing no good here. God gives, agreed Yar Ali cheerfully. The sun sinks westward. Soon the coolness of night will be upon us. Perhaps we shall find water yet, Sahib. Look, the terrain changes to the south. Arnie shaded his eyes against the dying sun. Beyond a level, barren expanse of several miles width, the land had indeed become more broken. Aborted hills were in evidence. The American slung his rifle over his arm and sighed. Eve ahead. We're food for the buzzards anyhow. The sun sank and the moon rose, flooding the desert with weird silver light. Drifted sand glimmered in long ripples, as if a sea had suddenly been frozen into immobility. Steve, parched fiercely by a thirst he dared not fully quench, cursed beneath his breath. The desert was beautiful beneath the moon, with the beauty of a cold marble Lorelei to lure men to destruction. What a mad quest, his weary brain reiterated. The fire of Asabanopal retreated into the mazes of unreality with each dragging step. The desert became not merely a material wasteland, but the grey mists of the lost eons, in whose depths dreamed sunken things. Blarney stumbled and swore. Was he failing already? Yar Ali swung along with the easy, tireless stride of the mountain man, and Steve set his teeth, nerving himself to greater effort. They were entering the broken country at last, and the going became harder. Shallow gullies and narrow ravines knifed the earth into wavering patterns. Most of them were nearly filled with sand. There was no trace of water. This country was once oasis country, commented Yar Ali. Allah knows how many centuries ago the sand took it. as the sand has taken so many cities in Turkestan. They swung on like dead men in a grey land of death. The moon grew red and sinister as she sank, and shadowy darkness settled over the desert before they had reached a point where they could see what lay beyond the broken belt. Even the big Afghan's feet began to drag, and Steve kept himself erect, only by a savage effort of will. At last, they toiled up a sort of ridge on the southern side of which the land sloped downward. We rest. There's no water in this hellish country. No use in going on forever. My legs are still as gun barrels. I couldn't take another step to save my neck. Here's a kind of stunted cliff, about as high as a man's shoulder, facing south. We'll sleep in the lee of it. Shall we not keep watch, Steve Sahib? We don't, answered Steve. If the Arabs cut our throats while we're asleep, so much the better. We're goners anyhow. With which optimistic observation Clarny lay down stiffly in the deep sand. But Yar Ali stood, leaning forward, straining his eyes into the elusive darkness that turned the star-flecked horizons to murky wells of shadow. Something lies on the skyline to the south, he muttered uneasily. A hill? I cannot tell, or even be sure that I see anything at all. You're seeing mirages already, said Steve irritably. Lie down and sleep. And so saying, Steve slumbered. The sun in his eyes awoke him. He sat up, yawning, and his first sensation was that of thirst. He lifted his canteen and wet his lips. One drink left. Yar Ali still slept. Steve's eyes wandered over the southern horizon, and he started. He kicked the recumbent Afghan. Hey, wake up, Ali. I reckon you weren't seeing things after all. There's your hill, and a queer-looking one, too. The Afridi woke as a wild thing wakes, instantly and completely, his hand leaping to his long knife as he glared about for enemies. His gaze followed Steve's pointing fingers, and his eyes widened. By Allah, and by Allah, he swore, we have come into a land of jinn. That is no hill, it is a city of stone in the midst of the sands. Steve bounded to his feet like a steel spring released. As he gazed with bated breath, a fierce shout escaped his lips. At his feet, the slope of the ridge ran down into a wide and level expanse of sand that stretched away south. And far away, across those sands, to his straining sight, the hill slowly took shape, like a mirage growing from the drifting sands. He saw great, uneven walls, massive battlements. All about crawled the sands like a living, sensate thing, drifted high about the walls, softening the rugged outlines. No wonder that at first glance the whole had appeared like a hill. Or a share, Barney exclaimed fiercely. Well, at El Jinn, the city of the dead. It wasn't a pipe dream after all. We found it, but by heaven, we found it. Come on, let's go. Yar Ali shook his head uncertainly, and muttered something about evil jinn under his breath, but he followed. The sight of the ruins had swept from Steve his thirst and hunger, and the fatigue that a few hours' sleep had not fully overcome.
Life changes. Sometimes unexpectedly. And some
fully overcome. He trudged on swiftly, oblivious to the rising heat, his eyes gleaming with the lust of the explorer. It was not altogether greed for the fabled gem that had prompted Steve Clarny to risk his life in that grim wilderness. Deep in his soul lurked the age-old heritage of the white man, the urge to seek out the hidden places of the world. And that urge had been stirred to the depths by the ancient tales. Now as they crossed the level waste that separated the broken land from the city, they saw the shattered walls take clearer form and shape, as if they grew out of the morning sky. The city seemed built of huge blocks of black stone, but how high the walls had been there was no telling because of the sand that drifted high about their base. In many places they had fallen away, and the sand hid the fragments entirely. The sun reached her zenith, and thirst intruded itself in spite of zeal and enthusiasm. But Steve fiercely mastered his suffering. His lips were parched and swollen, but he would not take that last drink until he had reached the ruined city. Yar Ali wet his lips from his own canteen and tried to share the remainder with his friend. Steve shook his head, plodded on. In the ferocious heat of the desert afternoon, they reached the ruin and passing through a wide breach in the crumbling wall, gazed on the dead city. Sand choked the ancient streets, lent fantastic form to huge, fallen, and half-hidden columns. So crumbled into decay and so covered with sand was the whole that the explorers could make out little of the original plan of the city. Now it was but a waste of drifted sand and crumbling stone, over which brooded like an invisible cloud an aura of unspeakable antiquity. But directly in front of them ran a broad avenue, the outline of which not even the ravaging sands and winds of time had been able to efface. On either side of the wide way were ranged huge columns, not unusually tall, even allowing for the sand that hid their bases, but incredibly massive. On the top of each column stood a figure carved from solid stone. In amazement, the winged bulls of Nineveh, the bulls with men's heads. By the saints, Sally, the old tales are true. The Assyrians did build this city. The whole tale's true. They must have come here when the Babylonians destroyed Assyria. Wow, this scene's a dead ringer for pictures I've seen. Reconstructed scenes of old Nineveh, and look. He pointed down the broad street to the great building which reared at the other end. A colossal, brooding edifice with columns and walls of solid black stone blocks defied the winds and sands of time. The drifting, obliterating sea washed about its foundations, overflowing into its doorways, but it would require 1,000 years to inundate the whole structure. An abode of devils, said Yar Ali, easily. The temple of Baal, exclaimed Steve. Come on, I was afraid we'd find all the palaces and temples hidden by the sand and have to dig for the gem. Little good it will do us, muttered Yar Ali. Here we die. I reckon so. Steve unscrewed the cap of his can. Let's take our last drink. Anyway, we're safe from the Arabs. They'd never dare come here with their superstitions. We'll drink and then we'll die, I reckon. But first we'll find the jewel. When I pass out, I want to have it in my hand. Maybe a few centuries later, some lucky son of a gun will find our skeletons and the gem. Here's to him, whoever he is. With which grim jest, Cloney drained his canteen. Yar Ali followed suit. They had played their last ace. The rest lay on the lap of Allah. They strode up the broad way. Yar Ali, utterly fearless in the face of human foes, glanced nervously to right and left, half expecting to see a horned and fantastic face leering at him from behind a column. Steve himself felt the somber antiquity of the place, and almost found himself fearing a rush of bronze war chariots down the forgotten streets, or to hear the sudden menacing flare of bronze trumpets. The silence in dead cities was...
Let's make something weird. I do love those sharks.
...that on the open desert. They came to the portals of the great temple.
Ooh.
Rows of immense columns flanked the wide doorway, which was ankle-deep in sand, and from which sagged massive bronze frameworks that had once raised
Let's use this one instead.
polished rotted away centuries ago. Into a mighty hall of misty twilight, whose shadowy stone roof was upheld by columns like the trunks of forest trees. The whole effect of the architecture was one of awesome magnitude and sullen, breathtaking splendor, like a temple built by somber giants for the abode of dark gods. Yar Ali walked fearfully, as if he expected to awake sleeping gods, and Steve, without the Afridi superstitions, yet felt the gloomy majesty of the place lay soft hands on his soul. No trace of a footprint showed in the deep dust on the floor. Half a century had passed since the affrighted and devil-ridden Turk had fled these silent halls. As for the Bedouins, it was easy to see why those superstitious sons of the desert shunned this city, and haunted it was, not by actual ghosts perhaps, but by the shadows of lost splendors. As they trod the sands of the hall, which seemed endless, Steve pondered many questions. How did these fugitives from the wrath of frenzied rebels build this city? How did they pass through the country of their foes? For Babylonia lay between Assyria and the Arabian desert, yet there had been no other place for them to go. Westward lay Syria and the sea, and north and east swarmed the dangerous Medes, those fierce Ions whose aid had stiffened the arm of Babylon to smite her foe to the dust. Possibly, thought Steve, Karashir, whatever its name had been in those dim days, had been built as an outpost border city before the fall of the Assyrian Empire, where the survivals of that overthrow fled. At any rate,
it was possible that Karashir had outlasted Nineveh by some centuries. A strange hermit city, no doubt, cut off from the rest of the world.
Hello.
Surely, Charlie had said, this was once fertile country, watered by oases, and doubtless in the broken country they had passed over the night before, there had been quarries that furnished the stone for the building of the city. Then what caused its downfall? Did the encroachment of the sands and the filling up of the springs cause the people to abandon it? Or was Karashir a city of silence before the sands crept over the walls? Did the downfall come from within or without? Did civil war blot out the inhabitants? Or were they slaughtered by some powerful foe from the desert? Barney shook his head in baffled chagrin. The answers to those questions were lost in the maze of forgotten ages. Allahu Akbar! They had traversed the great shadowy hall. At its further end they came upon a hideous black stone altar, behind which loomed an ancient god, bestial and horrific. Steve shrugged his shoulders as he recognized the monstrous aspect of the image. Aye, that was Baal, on whose black altar in other ages many a screaming, writhing, naked victim had offered up its naked soul. The idol embodied in its utter, abysmal, and sullen bestiality the whole soul of this demoniac city. Surely, thought Steve, the builders of Nineveh and Karashir were cast in another mold from the people of today. Their art and culture were too ponderous, too grimly barren of the lighter aspects of humanity to be wholly human as modern man understands humanity. Their architecture was repellent, of high skill, yet so massive, sullen, and brutish in effect as to be almost beyond the comprehension of moderns. The adventurers passed through a narrow door which opened in the end of the hall close to the idol, and came into a series of wide, dim, dusty chambers connected by column-flanked corridors. Along these they strode in the grey, ghostly light, and came at last to a wide stair, whose massive stone steps led upward and vanished